It's very good to be here today and to meet so many friends and to get to know some names and faces and connect those up together. My topic's entitled Converging Edges of the Midnight Cry, a journey of select seeker and Rogerine descendant faith paths in mid-state Connecticut. Living in the modern era, we have the advantages of the digital world and the digitalisation of historical documents from the early Adventist period, things like the Second Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, and the mass popularity of tracing family histories have given us new tools as researchers, given us an immense array and speed in which to use these powerful search mechanisms and these capabilities as historians to find out things that otherwise would have taken a lot longer. What once would have been a painstaking research for taking many years, visiting many places, can now be done in minutes or even in seconds. And that allows us to look at word patterns, allows us to look at common phrases, it allows us to look at differences and commonalities in different types of language between religious groups. You can see those patterns and see what's similar and what's different. We can look at patterns of surnames between different denominations and who uses certain phrases. And this starts to give us a bit of a broader picture of what happened all that time ago and to look for those common links, and the curiosity abounds to find out more about the story. This paper sets out to begin the journey of connecting the dots, looking for overlapping networks of surnames, places, ideas, doctrines, and practices, and to look at new areas yet unexplored as to what might be those origin roots of the Adventist Church. Adventists have traditionally looked to the immediate generation from where its pioneers came from, and to the places and the denominational faith of each of the founding families of origin. We've observed very strong links of heritage with the Christian connection, especially in New England, and have seen some significance in the Methodist background of Ellen White. Will Miller's call to his followers to come out of the corrupted churches of the day saw a variety of people from differing backgrounds come together in his Midnight Cry movement of the 1830s and the 1840s. And in the post-Great Disappointment era, we see a development of Seventh-day Adventist identity, with new doctrinal distinctives coming in from groups like the Seventh-day Baptists with their Seventh-day Sabbath through Rachel Oakes. Classically, Adventists have seen this as the single-souled Seventh-day Sabbath import. However, I'd like to suggest today that an analysis of the letters and the contributions in the early editions of the Present Truth, and also in the Second Advent Review and Sabbath Herald, shows us a much broader, earlier Seventh-day Sabbatarian story that's emerging. While Adventist historians have traditionally seen it as a story that takes place and later shape in New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts and New York State, it is to Connecticut, the state of the first Sabbath Sanctuary Conference, that an example of an earlier heritage with some common surnames, doctrines, word patterns, common phrases that we can use as a concrete example to examine this more concretely. It's in the early days of Connecticut that we find a distinctly separate expression of the Seventh-day Sabbath belief and an Advent expectation. It's expressed in another Midnight Cry movement. The historical record begins in the journal of the early Irish Quaker founder William Edmondson, who in 1675 was storm-swept into Connecticut's New London Harbour, and he sought to gather a Quaker meeting for worship. He was prevented from doing this by the Puritan authorities, and instead he was taken a few miles out of town by some sympathetic people who introduced him to a community of local families meeting in silence on the seventh-day Sabbath in a manner very similar to a Quaker meeting for worship. How they came to be meeting in this manner, in the first instance, has been a mystery yet unsolved, though this paper may go some way in beginning to tease out those origins. Unique for its time, this group formed out of the wealthiest family of Connecticut, the Rogers family, descending from the organised church, and became known as Rogerines, often as Rogerine Quakers, and at times as Rogerine Baptists. It was not for long that this newly established group were able to meet outside the established congregational church system without interference. Indeed, the founder, John Rogers, was to protest their religious liberty with vigour against the state for a near half-century, gathering his small group of New London families into what he described as the little flock and addressed as brethren and friends, common phrases found in the early Seventh-day Adventist literature. The Rogerine Seventh-day Sabbath observance pattern was most commonly expressed in the 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. scheme that we see early Adventist pioneer Joseph Bates adopt and advocate for a decade before the current sundown to sundown biblical pattern became normative. Rogerine descendants would continue their descent, that would moderate after the death of John Rogers, but again reignite in subsequent clashes with the state and the congregational established church. Of interest is a small strand of Rogerine descendants who continued a lingering interest in Seventh-day Sabbatarianism long past the time the other Rogerines had lapsed their one-time exclusive Seventh-day Sabbath observance and formally separated from their Seventh-day Baptist neighbours of Rhode Island. Rogerines, almost uniquely for their day, held to an acceptance of some diversity of belief, with the younger brother of John Rogers, Jonathan Rogers, marrying into a Seventh-day Baptist family and continuing his Seventh-day advocacy until his death. A degree of theological variety along a spectrum of orthodox belief was a pattern that would continue to be part of Rogerine faith into the 19th century, including a continued acceptance by some of the validity of the Seventh-day Sabbath. Or never a numerous group, the Rogerines were a group that attracted other people. They were a key focal point of religious dissent in New England. They attracted a wide range of people toward them, dissenting families elsewhere. They had interaction with other dissidents, especially those of people who were from England, who were separatists, who were searching for truth. And their origins together in navigating through the generational American migration paths across and beyond Connecticut has a focus on waiting for an anticipation of return of Christ. This study that I'm looking at is concerning the family faith paths, the journeys of these people. It may well be that the more vocal expression of the Rogerines' faith is indeed a more public expression of what is an otherwise underground seeker movement, easily ignored by history. The surnames of those associated with these two movements has a very high overlap with those that appear as letter writers and financial contributors in the Presence Truth and the Second Advent Review and Sabbath Herald. Persecution has a habit of spreading the flames of faith, especially through underground movements that become public through passionate people such as the Rogerines, seeing that persecution as evidence of the imminence of the coming kingdom of God. So it was the case as John Rogers published in 1692 his Midnight Cry, from the temple of God to the 10 virgins, slumbering and sleeping. Awake, awake, arise, and gird your loins, and trim your lamps, and behold, the bridegroom cometh. go ye there out for to meet him. Others to respond to his call include the seeker Noah Whipple, and among his broader family descendants would be a continued line combined with Rogerine and select seeker descent. Some would move beyond the reaches of New London, travelling also from neighbouring Rhode Island and Massachusetts towards the Connecticut state's capital, Hartford, in sparse clusterings of individual families centred in the mid-state towns and villages. An analysis of the theologies expressed in John Rogers' Midnight Cry of 1692 give us some striking similarities with themes that are held in common with early Seventh-day Adventist pioneers. Hints to the origins of Rogerine belief and worship suggest a pattern reminiscent of a variety of much earlier Reformation theologies, particularly from groups from the 16th century South German Anabaptist theologies. Among the notable similarities with Christian Hebraic themes are references to the two Adams, the significance of the seventh-day Sabbath in regard to the temple of God, and the work of Jesus in his high priestly office and his desire to dwell in the human habitation of the temple of his faithful followers. Typical of the theological interweaving is this quote: "And whereas the high priest under the First Testament did his priestly office in the temple of God, which temple was made with hands, which things were but shadows of heavenly things, but Jesus Christ is a high priest of the real temple of God, not made with hands, being typified from those high priests of the Old Testament, so likewise the saints' bodies, or church of God, was typified by that temple built by Solomon. For that temple was but a figure of the true temple of God, as appeareth by those scriptures such as Acts 7:48. But Solomon built him a house, howbeit the Most High dwelleth, not in temples made with hands, as saith the prophet, but the saints' bodies are the true temple of God, where God dwells, where Christ does his priestly office in." Historically, this theological teaching occurs within the setting of a long-lasting seeking movement held by many other diverse seekers of truth, including New England's chief dissenter, Roger Williams. These seekers are waiting, often in silence together, searching for truth and awaiting an apostolic restoration of the Church of God and the coming of his kingly presence. The earlier theological commonalities of John Rogers' Midnight Cry with themes of interest to those that attend the earnest, prayerful Sabbath sanctuary conferences, first beginning in mid-state Connecticut in 1847, can be seen among the adherents of Miller's Midnight Cry movement, with faith having been transmitted across the generations. Thus, it's possible to link these 19th century mid-state Connecticut Millerite Midnight Cry believers with the family descendants of those interested in John Rogers' 17th century Midnight Cry. Through family surnames, similar patterns of language, places of meeting, the doctrines they used, and their thematic ideas and practices. Proximity of the places of meeting of the first and second Sabbath sanctuary conferences to be held in Rocky Hill and Bristol in mid-state Connecticut, and the patterns of the location of the family migrations of much interest. Albert Belden's home becomes the location of the first conference at Rocky Hill, held as an earnest prayer meeting where the search for Bible truth emerged out of a gathered, silent and searching, melting meeting. The descriptions of this match that of the earlier seeker meetings from whom the Quakers emerged. While the rather silent collective expectant waiting would characterise some of the Millerites before the Great Disappointment, its ongoing practice amongst Seventh-day Adventists would eventually lapse. The Present Truth, the Seventh-day Adventist movement's first periodical, is first published out of Rocky Hill by James White in 1849. Soon after, the Harmon family more formally joined the small mid-state Connecticut Sabbatarian network when Ellen Gould Harmon's sister, Sarah, married Stephen Belden in August of 1851. Longer connections are seen when Ellen Harmon's parents reside for a time in Connecticut, and in 1866 we saw the death of her father Robert at Berlin, Hartford, Connecticut. George W. Holt of Mid-State Connecticut would certainly have to come close to Joseph Bates and James White in being the most frequent to travel and visit the far-flung Advent little flock, described by Ellen White as a people to be gathered. Thus, we can see that the well-known Millerite Adventist surnames such as Belden, Chamberlain and Holt are a small sample of a wider Seeker and intermarried Rogerine group of surnames, some of whom had mid-state connections, such as the Wilcox family, the Rogerine Rochus family. Most notably, there is the Rogerine descendant connection through the marriage of Erastus Chamberlain's daughter in becoming Mrs. Frances Rogers. Erastus Chamberlain was the key Seeker Sabbatarian patriarch in mid-state Connecticut. He was a significant local citizen, being a member of the local bank and a key shareholder in that bank, and also had involvement as a colonel in the army. He is the elder statesman anchor to the mid-state Sabbatarians. While pacifist identification would be notable amongst Seeker and Rogerine descendants, the reality of wars and the growing patriotism of the young nation saw pragmatic factors at play in succeeding generations of descendants. Though small in number of adherents, Chamberlain writes earnestly in the early Second Advent Review and Sabbath Herald of his concern for the scattered flock of God in Connecticut. A letter of 1851 describes hidden jewels scattered through Connecticut. Certainly not all Advent believers in the region were Seventh-day Sabbatarian. The First Day versus Seventh Day debate had emerged in the pages of the Bible Advocate of Hartford, Connecticut in 1847 and 1848. And Merlin Burness has presented this interaction well in his doctoral dissertation. The ongoing debate would resurface again as the geographic focus of the surviving Advent movements moved further north and west in the decades to follow. The interaction of the Seeker and Rogerine descendants of mid-state Connecticut with the Seventh-day Baptist Church close to Rocky Hill in the mid-state town of Bristol, also known as Farmington and as Burlington, is an area requiring much more detailed research. The outreaches of those in the orbit of that church appear to stretch as far as Springfield, Massachusetts. The key reason why this locality in Bristol is of interest is because of the lesser known Second Sabbath Sanctuary Conference that occurs there soon after the first. Its hosting occurs at a time when the Seventh-day Baptist Church had been disbanded in that location for 2 decades. However, several Seventh-day Sabbatarians remained scattered in the surrounding communities, verified by an analysis of the Seventh-day Baptist cemetery records with burials in the decades thereafter. Many of these families had left the region to settle in another Seventh-day Baptist settlement in New York State at Brookfield. Interestingly, this is the location where James and Ellen White later visit the home of Ira and Rhoda Abbey in 1848 after the Third Sabbath Sanctuary Conference. It is but one indicator of a continued peripheral settlement interaction of Seeker descendants living in close proximity to Seventh-day Baptist communities in the areas of central and western New York State. The significance of Ellen White's visionary role to bring gospel order a Quaker and seeker phrase to the often threshing small Sabbatarian groupings will continue well beyond the first two Sabbath Sanctuary conferences of the late 1840s in mid-state Connecticut. There and elsewhere, we see a pattern of common usage of what are some common seeker, Quaker and Rogerine language with distinctive language unique to them. Some will be variations of expressions found in the contemporary vernacular of the mid-19th century Quaker life. Each would be distinguishable to some extent in manifestations through its frequency and manner of usage, and also other discernible differences. Variations of phrases and themes such as friends of truth, waiting for the way to open, leadings, sufferings, opportunities, present truth, the spirit of prophecy, speaking to an individual's spiritual condition, testimonies, faith and practice, and the plain dating of the days of the week would feature in a wider development in the early Seventh-day Adventist church movement. Wider geographic evidence of the usage of these and other common phrases is found in the early years of Seventh-day Adventist literature. It's at the first two Sabbath Sanctuary conferences held in mid-state Connecticut that we see the beginnings of a common synthesis of key ideas, doctrines, phrases and practices, beginning to collectively emerge as a newly emerging movement progresses forward and an overlapping network that predates it eventually fades into the distance. It is a unity of old truths made new again that continue to slowly develop, modify, solidify and form into the new forming Seventh-day Adventist movement as it held its conferences over succeeding years and finally determined to organise as a church in 1863. And so it is that today that we end our commemoration of the 150th year of that event and reflect upon the patterns that are emerging from the findings of this new research evidence in the lives of select seekers and Rogerine descendants of the Midnight Cry in mid-state Connecticut.
Hello everyone. First I want to thank you for staying on. We've had a long day and personally I feel just filled with information on Adventist history. And I passed out a copy of my presentation. It is available, but notice on it, it says a draft. And I will not read it to you because it will take all the time. But I'm here primarily for this paper as a result of an earlier paper I presented at the ASDAH conference at Lincoln University, the 7th conference, in which I presented a paper which was entitled The Shaping of Early Eastern Caribbean Adventist Leaders, Charles Cave and G.E. Peters, in which I argued in that paper that essentially the history of Adventism in the Caribbean is probably an accurate history, but it's missing a tremendous element. And so really I'm here to talk about a very small part of the Caribbean and a very small part of our mission field. But I think that what I'm saying will also apply to other areas. Officially, according to the record, our church started in the Caribbean in 1883. And that date and the circumstances around that has been repeated over and over during the 19th century and into the 20th century by scholars in our official works. And in that paper, I show that essentially that date and that event is not fully accurate. And the reason for that is it seems as though when I read in the official histories of the Adventist Church about the Caribbean, it is written essentially from a missionary perspective. What I call, or what historians would call, the dominant narrative is essentially one out of the country in the mission field as the full story when it really is not. And the story is much fuller. There's so many other things going on that you never hear about. And so I could have come to this conference and read a paper on an individual, but I felt that I needed to drive myself into looking at this other narrative, Caribbean Adventist narrative. And there will be an Australian Adventist narrative, and a New Zealand Adventist narrative, and an African Adventist narrative. And I wanted to see what we need to do in order to pull this narrative out and to look to pry the sources. And I'm really very concerned too with the whole idea of primary sources and what they are. And I was very much encouraged. Some of us went to the panel before, where Dr. Francis spoke about one individual in Barbados who has never been recognized in the official record and did a tremendous amount. And I came with that same experience. And I've said this before to some of you. I grew up, I'm a fourth generation Adventist, and I came up hearing about a Dr. Cave. Dr. Cave says that you shouldn't eat and drink. You shouldn't eat between meals. You should do this and that. And I assumed that he lived when I lived, but he did not. But not only my parents, my grandparents, and other homes I would go to. And then as a history student, graduate student, I began to look at what our church said about the Caribbean. And there was nothing about him, and nothing about so many other people. And I wondered why. And then when I recognized that he had gone to Bahal Creek to study nursing, and then became a doctor, and then came back and started a sanitarium in Barbados, I felt we needed to do something in order to have this other aspect of the narrative. And so my paper is divided into 6 different sections. The first section is dealing with the significance of early Adventism. The second section is the review of early writings and authors. The third is dealing with an examination of the archival sources of early English or Anglo-Adventism, both here at the General Conference and also in the Caribbean. And then the fourth section deals with a review of the most recent writings, which actually carries the Caribbean narrative. Because what we find occurring in the Caribbean, for example, in the 1960s, is these countries become independent countries with indigenous leaders. And it's amazing to see how the leadership of our church also changes to Caribbean individuals. And they're the ones carrying the narrative, writing. And they continue even to this very day. It's amazing that this small part of the Caribbean has produced 2 associate editors of the review, Roy Adams and now Lyle Caesar. A number of individuals. And of course, in dealing with the subject of historical sources, there are a number of challenges. And so I point out the challenges. And then finally, there should be some solutions. And so I talk about the strategy. What strategies need to be used in terms of getting the full narrative. And I'm suggesting that this experience in the Caribbean, in dealing with Caribbean Adventist history, can be multiplied across the whole continent. This is just small countries within the Inter-American division, but the same issues will be for the Inter-American division and all the other divisions. So the first section quickly, the significance. So people wonder why you want to deal with the early Anglo-Caribbean Adventist experience. Well, for one thing, this area is one of the earliest places where Adventism was embraced outside of the United States. The area I'm talking about is what is now called the Commonwealth Caribbean, Jamaica and the Eastern Caribbean, including Guyana. Primarily, the research that has been done is suggesting that there's something not fully expressed in what the official record is, and so we need to look at it. Thirdly, what we find is that on preliminary research, the first quote-unquote missionaries to the Anglo-Caribbean might not be American missionaries. It is very possible, and I can substantiate this, that there were African Americans, there were Afro-Caribbean individuals who migrated to this country, heard about Adventism, became committed to Adventism, and went back as missionaries, but they're not in the record. And there are a number of them. The fourth reason to look at this area is, if you look at the official designation of places by the Adventist Church, official church, of places that should have missionaries go to, the Caribbean is not one of them. It's essentially where? Europe and British Commonwealth. But the Caribbean features quite early. Also, it would seem to me too that it would be a good thing to look at it too, in terms of the recognition that some of the first baptisms of people of African descent seem to have occurred in the Caribbean. That is quite interesting to me because, for example, in my research, when I look at the first official missionary that came to the islands, in order to baptize those who were committed to the church, although the population of the English-speaking Caribbean was essentially of African descent, you had a number of planters, families, merchants, and so on, and they were the ones who initially began to write to Bahal Creek, asking for information on the Sabbath and on health matters. But then when the missionaries actually came, the colporteurs came before, but when the missionaries came and began to hold evangelistic meetings and have call for baptisms, what we find is that because of the pressures that were brought, both religious, because the main church was the Church of England, the Anglican Church, and because of their business, these planters were producing sugar, that was producing alcohol, and so on and so forth. Most of them did not commit themselves fully, although there were many who did. Some of them were actually medical doctors. 2 of them were medical doctors, which was quite interesting. But most of them did. But the majority of people who actually were willing to be baptized were people of African descent. And what I noticed was with the first missionary, Dexter Ball, he seemed to be in a state of shock. And so he left Barbados. And then he went to Antigua. And when he saw the same thing occurring there, and the church was actually brought from England to to Antigua, he had a vision like the Apostle Peter. And so when he came back to Barbados, then he baptized this large number of folk who were of African descent. Another reason why we should look, the significance is because this area of the Caribbean is actually the cradle of what we call the Inter-American Division, which is the largest division. And I think that when we look at the beginnings of the church in this area, it gives some indication of what the church had to do, what the missionaries had to do, what the native people had to do in order to be able to spread and make this very effective. Now, the second section, quickly, is reviewing the early literature of Adventism. Quickly, I would say the early literature of Adventism and the primary sources can be found more here in North America than in the Caribbean itself. And among this, the most prominent of the early literature, of course, would be the correspondence first by members of the residents in the Caribbean, actually writing to Battle Creek, asking for literature, for information, and also to send people. And of course, the colporteurs came, and then the missionaries came, and that kind of thing. And also the letters that the missionaries wrote back that actually were printed, many of them printed in the Review and Herald. And a question I had and I asked in the last session was, do we consider, as historians, do we consider the Review and Herald primary sources? Because in my teaching, I instruct students that the newspapers are not worth sometimes what they're printed on, and you have half-truths and so on. But it is a tool that was used, it seems, by the writers, the early writers of Adventism in the Caribbean in order to create this official position. But I'm suggesting that if we return to the sources and look closely at the correspondence, I think we will come up with a different conclusion. In terms of the Caribbean itself, so we have the Review and Herald, and of course in the Caribbean itself, the missionaries came and they produced a number of magazines and newsletters and so on, and we have copies of those here and also in the Caribbean. The great challenge, I think, is with the sources in the Caribbean. There are documents from the very early period, but there is no collection of these documents. There is no storage of these documents. We have 2 Adventist universities that are accredited in the Caribbean, credited here, and they're very good with good library resources. They also have E.G. White research centers and so on. But when you approach them about the native history, about the history of the people in the Caribbean, there's absolutely nothing. But there is history there, but it is held by individuals like Professor Francis. It is held by most of the churches. For example, the mother church in Barbados, the King Street Church, they have a church record that goes all the way back to 1890 when the church began. Every person who joined that church, their full name, when they were baptized, and some comment about them, up to the present. On the other hand, when I approach over the years the conferences or the unions, it seems to me that as soon as a certain group moves from the conference and another group comes in, or the union, those papers seem to be of no regard. And so what we find occurring is that there's a possibility for us still to do something about this, and so this is what I have in my recommendations. Now, the 4th section of my paper deals with this transition. Up to about 1950, whatever you read in the printed work came essentially from the missionaries. But as I said before, there's this tremendous transformation that occurs in the countries themselves when they decide to, there was a federation that the British organized, didn't work fully. It was called the West Indies Federation, and it broke up. And then the countries Jamaica in 1962 and Trinidad in 1962. It was interesting to see that the parallel that is going on between what's going on in the church and what's going on in the secular world. And what we find occurring is that from here on, we're going to find that the narrative is carried and the perspective is carried from that of Caribbean individuals who are working and understanding the challenges that they actually face. And of course, by the 1970s, we're going to have a number of people graduating from these senior colleges coming to North America and wanting to study about the history of the church in the Caribbean. We even have people going to the secular universities, the University of the West Indies in Jamaica, St. Augustine, and in Trinidad and in Barbados. Individuals seriously writing, sometimes only for their bachelor's, as is required there in some courses, and also for their masters, writing about the Adventist church, and they're writing from a Caribbean perspective. And we're going to have a number of people beginning to write from that period on and giving us a clear understanding of the Adventist experience in the Caribbean. And Caribbean individuals become so sophisticated that by the 21st century now we are having autobiographies written by Adventists who started humbly in the Caribbean with a vision of Christian education in the Caribbean, becoming very successful, and then after they retire, write about their experience. In fact, some of the individuals really didn't retire at the time. One of the first autobiographies is by Dr. Thompson, who was the president of North Caribbean University for quite a while, and so on. About the challenges. The challenges we face in researching early Caribbean Adventist records. First is the scarcity and the fragmentation of the nature of the existing pioneering documents. There's a number of them that exist, and I believe that more could be done. Secondly, the challenge of the absence of Adventist. I have what? 2 minutes? Yeah, okay. And the absence of Adventist archives in the Caribbean. It is very difficult to get letters, reports, photographs, and so on, except they're held by individuals and not by the church, by the universities. What I believe too is one of the challenges is a lack of appreciation by many of the administrative leaders and also educators and even historians in dealing with Adventism in the Caribbean. It is amazing that we have what is taught in these two universities. Adventist history is taught, but it is taught using the books we heard about this morning. And except for Dr. Francis and others who would incorporate other books with it, you could take a course in Adventist history in the Caribbean and not mention one thing about the Caribbean itself, but get all involved with what is going on in the 19th century in Adventism here. And so I think there's an absence of the existing policy regarding the collection and preservation. And so as a result of this, then I'm going to give you some recommendations. 1 minute. In terms of my recommendations, I want to suggest that we encourage these institutions in the Caribbean to begin to develop modestly an archives that deals with early Adventist history. I also want to suggest that maybe we need the folk at this conference and our good archivist, director of archives here, begin to see if he could communicate and get some letters going to some of the leaders so that they would again begin to appreciate. Now, some of them do on an individual level, but when corporately there's no policy and so on. I also want to suggest, not only in terms of collecting things, but we still have living a number of individuals who have been Adventists over 50 years. You know, one of the points I wanted to make first is this, really, that each generation asks different things of history. And the young Adventists today are asking different questions, and they want to know about what really happened in the early period in our region of the world. And we're not fulfilling that. And so one of the things I'm suggesting is that we have oral history projects, whereby these people, before they're passed on, we can interview them. I've interviewed a number of individuals already. And so we have them, so we can study them further. I think I'm going. And of course, the obvious question is that we encourage the universities in the Caribbean to incorporate the local Adventist history into the teaching of the Adventist history course. Thank you very much for your attention.
The mid-1880s diary of one John Dortch consists largely of mundane facts. But in the aggregate, this quotidian material offers us a benchmark of Adventist faith in the particular. One cannot peruse Dortch's diaries without noting the exemplary quality of his life, without even a hint of spiritual pride or even spiritual self-consciousness. Dortch narrates a life that even the most cynical of readers would find difficult to fault. Don't you just love Adventists of that type? Yet for all its temporal and spiritual robustness, Dortch's diary contains 2 entries. And this is a set of diaries covering at least 8 years. There are 2 entries in this entire collection of diaries which potentially threaten the whole. That is the exemplary qualities of the entire set. And now I read from the diary. On December 5, 1884, Dortch writes that a tramp arrived at his place. And I quote, "At night a tramp came to the door and knocked. And I told him to come in unless you are a tramp, and if you are, you can go on." This line mars the exemplary life record and marks a singular departure from what we as 21st century readers would consider an appropriate response to a homeless person. Yet at the same time, Dortch's manner and apparent attitude towards the tramp resonates perfectly with conventional morality of the late 19th century. As they saw it, we ought to help those who are in real need, as long as they are recognizable members of a class that was commonly referred to then as the worthy poor, and you'll find that same phrase in the writings of Ellen White. However, tramps by definition were not the members of the worthy poor class, and therefore the moral code dictated that they should not be helped, since to help them in any manner or form would be to encourage a life of vice and criminality. Now, nearly 1 year later, in the fall of 1885, he writes the following: October 7, Wednesday, clear and cold. Dan easily took the coat from the tramp. End of quote. We don't learn the particulars of the confrontation. Enigmatic and teasing, isn't it? But we can surmise that Dan easily took the coat from the tramp because the tramp had pilfered the coat, because after all, that's what tramps do, and easily retrieved the coat as its rightful owner. These are both Seventh-day Adventists, new converts. Slightly less clear is the reason for why Dortch would bother to mention this in his diary. Typically, you get a reference to how his wife just set a hen. Whatever the reason might be, the coat entry functions rhetorically and evidentially as moral support for Dortch's summary rejection of the tramp at his door the previous year. Dortch's moral universe enjoys a kind of perfect unity. Tramps are immoral, and now we have the proof. The moral premise is tramps, by definition as a class, are unworthy members of the poor class. And the reason that we know that is because a year later a tramp stole a coat. Further examination of Dortch's diaries soon reveals that they are not confessional by nature. The exemplary nature of Dortch's life as recorded in the diaries tells us something about the nature of 19th century diaries as a genre, I believe. These are not diaries inspired by the likes of Augustine's Confessions or Bunyan's Grace Abounding to the Chief of Sinners. Instead, Dortch's diaries participate in a form of popular autobiography whose primary goal would be to demonstrate the worth, the essential worth, perhaps even perfection, of the author's life. Welcome to the Victorian age. Not its failings or gross sins, and what I view as a grave departure from the biblical and indeed larger Christian genre of confessional autobiography. The Christian diary of the 19th century evokes a hortatory mood that in turn recalls our civilization's pre-Christian roots as discovered in the Homeric and Virgilian epics. Dortch does not narrate his sins. Do you? Although he does describe his own mother's public tobacco confession. Oh, that's in there. Instead, he narrates his virtues exclusively. And of course, rejecting the tramp is a virtue. Elsewhere, I have described the tension that exists in English literature between the politics of confession and the politics of the exemplary. Of course, in purely political terms, the exemplary always wins, to the extent that political success assumes at least the appearance of virtue. However, the Bible valorizes humility and repentance as the necessary ground of a truly virtuous life. This tension, of course, not only informs Dortch's decision to record his virtues to the exclusion of his vices, it also plays into Dortch's attitude towards tramps, since the tramp, by virtue of both his appearance and his separation from any settled community, epitomizes moral failure. One cannot imagine a greater natural antipathy than the one that existed between the Seventh-day Adventist John Dortch, small farmer, active personal evangelist, generous neighbor, courageous and consistent advocate of his faith, and church founder and builder, and the abject figure of the 1880s tramp. Our narrative, of course, must also consider the larger and ongoing debate in 19th century America over what to do about the tramp phenomenon. The debate was essentially a moral one. Were tramps merely social pariahs to be feared for their vices, their parasitism, and their threat to the American way of life? Or were tramps, this is familiar stuff, were tramps victims of an inexorable industrial blight? Hard-working men unjustly thrown out of work due to a fickle business cycle inherent to greedy capitalism. And you can hear the labor journalists writing as I speak here. By the 1880s, trade unions and their supporters had denied any distinction between the good and the bad tramp. They were all good because they were victims. As John Swinton wrote in 1885, the tramp was nothing less than a, quotes, creation of a villainous class legislation as a means to ridding society of unwanted, unneeded laborers. Labor further argued that anti-tramp legislation was had simply reclassified an entire generation of unemployed men as social undesirables, men who through no fault of their own could not find work. The labor movement identified a demonstrable link between downturns in the economy and general hysteria as to the burgeoning hordes of tramps. As Samuel Gompers testified before Congress in 1883, as soon as the economy picked up in 1880, complaints about tramps magically disappeared. As labor saw it, tramping was nothing less than a business-induced phenomenon characteristic of unprincipled industrial capitalism. Tramps were victims of forces beyond their control. As one historian has observed, the earliest documented mention of the word tramp in the American press occurs in 1874, only shortly after the Wall Street Panic of 1873. By the winter of 1875, Mass starvation of working class families had become a stark reality in America's larger cities. Thus, tramping functioned as the necessary means for men to find work in order to feed their children. That's labor. On the other side of the debate, you had big business and the newspaper barons who represented their interests. I'm going to cut this down a bit. They, of course, argue that tramps are basically lazy. A Chicago newspaper seriously, and this was not ironic, suggested poisoning the food given to tramps at soup kitchens in order to kill them off, thus ridding America of unnecessary pests. This is genocide. Chicago newspaper. During this same period, American charities, local city governments, and the Christian churches that sponsored soup kitchens began to consider ways in which they might discriminate between what they termed the worthy and the unworthy poor, and you will find this exact same binary construct in the writings of Ellen White. You don't just have the poor anymore, you've got the good ones and the bad ones. In 1877, the New York Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor summarily dropped some 2,000 names from its registration list on the grounds that these were men who were capable of work. No more aid. No more welfare. As the historian Michael Davis has observed, by excluding single men from relief, it would seem that scientific charity, as it was termed at the time, ensured that they would actually expand the reproduction of the very tramps which they set out to suppress. Now, here's another example. In Indianapolis, a soup house was denied a building permit because it had become, quotes, impossible to discriminate between the worthy and the unworthy poor. And I'd like you just to stick to that point. I don't know if you've ever been confronted with a homeless person who wants something from you. I don't know if you've ever tried to discriminate through observation or interview in order to determine whether they were worthy or not. I can assure you it's impossible to know. I've tried. Some are con artists, but they might not be. You just don't know. And all of us know this problem. So the best thing to do is to just pretend you don't see them. Drop their names from the rolls, deny the soup kitchen. It's impossible to take care of the poor because we don't know which ones deserve it and which ones don't. There's some theological implications here. This, of course, is the crux problem. Once you've decided not to take the risk of inadvertently helping someone who doesn't really deserve it, you soon arrive at a point where you can't help anybody at all. Interestingly enough, a similar obsession was found even among the tramps. The Chicago school who researched this came up with the following 3 grades of tramps. The hobo works and wanders. The tramp dreams and wanders, and the bum drinks and wanders. I didn't know hobos were at the top of the pile, but apparently they are. Having established a fairly secure informing context for Dortch's attitude towards tramps. Now, this is a secular context. I've done what historians do. Here's the context. There's the particular man we call Dortch. Now, historians do this all the time. We now interpret Dortch by referring to this context, and I think it's useful. But Dortch is a Seventh-day Adventist, so there's one other context. And of course, all context is really text. There's one other text that we've got to shove in here, and you can guess who it might be. Ellen G. White, which is another way of saying Scripture, because that's what she's working from, at least. Now, what does Ellen White have to say about this? She invokes the same binary construction of the worthy and unworthy poor. But Ellen White does something that none of the other Christian groups that I've researched and none of the governmental agencies that I've researched did. They wanted to discriminate between the unworthy and the worthy poor. They assumed the binary, and they found it was impossible to tell the difference, and therefore they started to shut down channels of aid. What did Ellen White do? Well, she says the following. We are to love our neighbors, quote, as ourselves, and towards both these classes we shall do the right thing under the guidance and counsel of sound wisdom. What does she mean by the right thing? Well, let's turn to ministry of healing. If one comes to our door and asks for food, this is uncannily similar to, of course, Dortch's life experience. If a person comes to our door and asks for food, we should never turn him away hungry. His poverty may be the result of unjust fortune. You hear the labor argument? It's there. Ellen White, the Liberal, a book not yet written. At the same time, Ellen White goes out of her way to argue that although we must always help the poor, we don't help all the poor in precisely the same way. She develops the concept that there are people who are unworthy poor who we are to help, but we don't help them by giving them handouts. We help them, and wait for this, by inviting them into our homes, where they may be reformed through close personal association. Yeah, I don't read a lot of Ellen White, do I? It's too painful because my conscience can barely take it. I mean, I'm being a little ironic here. I do read a lot of Ellen White. It's painful. The woman is radical. This is a radical solution to poverty that frankly Adventists are rejecting. We should seek to understand the needs of the poor. And she's talking about the unworthy poor here and the distress. We have to study them and to give them the help that will benefit most. To give thought and time and personal effort costs far more than merely giving money, but this is the truest charity. Any social worker can tell you the same. Here Mrs. White confirms the larger binary construct of the worthy-unworthy poor, yet at the same time refuses to exclude the unworthy poor from aid on the simple grounds that we actually can't tell the difference. So you have to give aid to all. Whereas the larger American society abandons the poor because they cannot discriminate between the worthy and unworthy poor. And I would submit to you that this is a clear example of a contrast between a biblical morality and mere moralism. And frankly, most Adventists are more moralists, not biblical moralists. We practice moralism. How do you escape the trap of moralism? You read your scripture and you apply it as it reads. And Ellen White does that amazingly well. Her moral sense cannot be faulted. There's this haunting phrase in her writings, if one comes to our door and asks for food, we should not turn him away, exposes, now we turn back to Dortch's moral blindness. Now there are two rival contexts here, the biblical, the universal context, I might even call it the Tao, following C.S. Lewis's mood, and the larger social context with its insistence that only the worthy poor deserve our food, which is a pseudo-Christian context, but of course many Christians clung to it. The latter expresses what is essentially a secular distortion of the biblical mandate, but its half-hearted allegiance to the biblical command to feed the hungry, the worthy hungry that is, lends it a measure of decency. We can just make out here the lineaments of Nietzsche's God is Dead critique of 19th century German Christianity. Dortch's response to the tramp bears no resemblance to any recognizable biblical command, yet Dortch and the so-called larger Christian society of which he was a member could not see this. A secular and conventional moralism had displaced the living word of Scripture, with the result that politics now shaped a key moral principle. The irony here is that within a decade, Dortch spends 44 days in prison for working on a Sunday. Now you know where I'm going with this. He's exemplary when it comes to withstanding secular or larger Christian pressure with respect to the Sabbath. This is just Adventism through and through. We have our salient beliefs that we will defend under persecution. But we don't give a fig for the poor. Pardon my French, but Dortch doesn't see the problem. Dortch redeems himself, as it were, by holding to the fourth commandment without regard to trends within the larger society. But when it comes to the poor, it's another story. Now, I think in this respect, Dortch emerges as a paradigmatic figure. He is us. He, of course, he's an anonymous figure in Adventist history, but he's representative of a mood and a praxis which we all know too well. We have our peculiar doctrines. They are Seventh-day Sabbath, State of the Dead, pre-Advent judgment. But we're rather selective when it comes to other, less convenient, and perhaps even more central aspects of the biblical moral mandate. And the irony, of course, here is that Adventism possesses, by virtue of the writings of Mrs. White, the seeds of a thoroughgoing and radical biblical morality. I like to give this lecture to my students entitled Ellen White and Animal Rights. She makes an amazing case for animal rights. And it's very much a progressive case, but you'll never come across that in an Adventist history. It's moving. And it's actually a very good argument for vegetarianism, although she doesn't take it there. I do, but she doesn't. You won't hear that, because we are selective, especially in our Adventist teaching of history. Ellen White observes a morality that costs much more than merely tossing gifts to the poor. She envisions us bringing the unworthy poor into our own homes and into our very lives. Now here the historian must pause, for this narrative window also functions as a mirror. That's an analogy we've heard before today. It's a good medieval concept. We read in order to learn who we are. And in spite of our negative judgment of Dortch's refusal to feed the tramp at the door, we must admit that he is one of us. We also freely pick and choose our moralities. Of course, we cannot dismiss Dortch as if we know him entirely. We possess enough damning evidence to incriminate ourselves, I think, but as for Dortch, the man, his full narrative, his hidden motives, the unrevealed circumstances remain sealed until Judgment Day. I don't want to turn Dortch into a pariah. Indeed, I admire the man immensely. My admiration for him is strong. He represents so much of what was best in 19th century Adventism in America. Yet for all of that, he was only human. And as such, his narrative cannot avoid the moral imperative that we as historians study his life and narrate it in such a way that we may imitate the good and avoid the bad. And in conclusion, I would just like to read a text from Leviticus. This is Leviticus 25:35, and this, of course, is the context which defines Dortch as a believer. And if thy brother be waxen poor and fallen in decay, you shall relieve him. Yea, even though he be a stranger or a sojourner, i.e. a tramp, he may come and live with you.
Well, we have a few minutes yet for questions for our three panelists. Who would like to begin? David.
Thank you for all three papers. Just two comments rather than questions. Firstly, to Garry, I thought that was absolutely fascinating and incredibly insightful, and the result of very painstaking research, and I think a good model actually of how explore. I think this is one area of that is a weakness of Adventist historiography if compared with wider historiography. That certainly I know in my own work on the early modern period, one regularly explores family connections and sees where it takes one, and that hasn't been done so much in Adventist historiography. So, greatly just wanted to affirm what you're doing and then the methodology. And to Karl, I thought it was a sparkling paper. Thank you very much. I would just the one thing I would observe is that the concept of the deserving and undeserving poor actually goes back to the Speenenland system of poor relief in early modern England, and was resurrected in the 1990s by British politicians, and is still there. But I mean, that concept is a very long one in Anglo-American political economy, and it's just worth being aware of that. But thank you very much.
It even features in Pygmalion.
Oh, it does.
Good. Yeah, thank you. Other comment or question?
Well, just for Dr. Wilcox, I'm doing this only partially tongue-in-cheek, but usually we have the sermon as a devotional to start the program rather than end it. Although, then I tried to figure out if it was a scathing rebuke of one of our political parties. Do your students take offense at that?
Oh, yeah, I hope to cause offense in the classroom on a consistent basis. When people feel offended, there's a chance that they might change, a slight one. No, I know, I would like to say that when I do history or teach literature, I have a clear moral intention. And I don't want to massage the evidence to support, I'm not teaching didactically all the time, but there is a point at which, in my view, all historical narrative raises the question, what is right and what is wrong? I don't know how you can avoid that if you write narrative. And we develop these distancing postures, and we refuse to go there, and yet that's what historical narrative does by definition. It raises the question, is Dortch right or wrong? So, yeah, I guess it has that didactic element in it. But it's in the record, isn't it?
Yes, question here.
For Dr. Phillips.
Please identify yourself.
Emory Charles with Howard University. I just wanted to know if you have any thoughts on why the narrative, the Caribbean narrative, isn't done. Do you have at some point have you thought about why this is not included? Is it because Caribbean people didn't do it, or is it because someone believed it wasn't important? What do you think?
I think it's all the above, really. I think it's all the above. If you talk to people who, I've talked to a number of individuals, and sometimes they wonder, what I did is really, I didn't do it for a record. I didn't do it to be recognized. It's in terms of recognition, and they'll be rewarded eventually. But my argument is that we need to motivate young Adventists and let them see that there were missionaries that came, but there were other people who were there. The missionaries came and they saw, they baptized, and they left. But the people who remained there, they had a number of challenges which were quite different from the missionaries. And they were doing this over and over and constantly and bringing people into the church. And actually changing the attitude of the government and the greater society toward Adventism. Because when Adventism came, originally it was seen as a cult. It was seen very negatively in the Caribbean, English-speaking Caribbean. Anything American was a little less than anything that was English. If it came from England, it probably would be better and that kind of thing. But it changed. I know, for example, today we have the Governor General of Jamaica, who is an Adventist. You have a number of people in all the states there. There was a Governor General of Antigua that was an Adventist. I mean, there's so many other people, and now it is recognized as a leading church with all the others, because they had to deal with when they came, it was the Moravians, the Methodists, the Catholics, in Trinidad it was Catholicism, and so on. And so some of these people really were not self-promoters, and so what have I did, for example, I have their notes of individuals who became Adventists in the Caribbean and ended up as missionaries in Africa. Some who came from the Caribbean became great evangelists here.
That seems to be a common problem. I'm trying to identify people who say, well, I don't really want
to be
promoted.
Yeah.
And there's somehow the view that they're taking some glory that doesn't belong to them.
Yeah, exactly, yes. But I try to convince them that, no, this is not for you. This is for the next generation. If Jesus doesn't come, people need to know. And as I said, people now are asking, young people are asking different questions. In my time, we were satisfied to just listening about the founding fathers and so on. These young people are not. They have a different orientation altogether. And as I said earlier, many of them do not attend Adventist schools. Even if they did one or, maybe just high school or maybe, and so on. So therefore, I think it is imperative that we pursue it and keep it as well. Thank you.
Joan.
But don't you also think that it's because the church as an institution hasn't decided that the narrative of the locals or the natives
Yeah.
are important. And I was struck when I was beginning to think about things Adventist and in my region, the Latin American, the Caribbean, by Greenleaf came out, and it is all from the missionaries' point of view.
Yes.
And it made me think, oh wait, well we're not important, when I knew there were local leaders in Jamaica who had come as missionaries to Barbados.
Exactly.
And all of that story
Yeah.
isn't there.
isn't
And so the dominant group, or whoever controls the record,
Right.
they're the ones we have to ask now, can you get the records for some of these indigenous people if you want? And it's not just the Caribbean, you can go
Right.
other parts of the world, it's the same
That's
issue.
history all over, yeah.
We need to make that switch, I think,
Yeah.
to a new source of history.
Yeah.
I want to propose that Dr. Wilcox meets Dr. Phillips and the common man Dorch is highlighted in the Caribbean. Because Dr. Francis mentioned that, the average person's story is not told. I would add, unless it's compelling. Like we have Katarangoso in Micronesia. If it's really compelling and there's a sellable aspect to it, a commercial aspect to it, it's told. But right,
Compared to the missionaries.
I also believe that in Dr. Phillips' piece that the history of Adventism in the Caribbean, a very prevalent theme is the theme of agency. And when we often look at ethnic history and this whole missionary perspective, we leave that out. The missionary is the agent. Everyone else is almost being acted upon. The narrative of the ship captain who throws the tracts on the harbor. That's a thrilling story. I mean, everyone loves that. It's so
Pathetic. It's pathetic.
God moved.
but there's no agency there. And of course, we know the backstory that there was tremendous agency because people were there who did something about it. And I mean, of course, even before that, there were people who were agents.
We do need to move on, and it would be wonderful to be able to continue this discussion for another hour. And maybe those of you who do have an evening free and would like to go together for supper, or we can arrange something like that. But we do need to move towards the end of things. I see George's hand and David, and then why don't we hear? Go ahead, David.
There's 2 points about what has just been said. The first is it does reflect a weakness of Adventist historiography, which is that studies of churches in missionary activity some years ago moved towards looking at what was the reception, what was the agency of the people with whom missionaries interacted. That's something where the wider mission history, which is quite a flourishing subdiscipline, went some time ago, and we haven't. But equally, that said, I'm thinking of Joan's point in particular about what is valued. But we have to say in a global church, not only who values it, but where is it valued? And if you look at Greenleaf's most recent book on South America, not just Latin America, it has much more of the story from the South American point of view, because a lot of it's told from the record collection of the South American division. You could say it's not told from the history from below. It doesn't have the stories of the Dorch. It has church administrators, but it certainly has the local point of view. So I think perhaps we are beginning to move beyond this very stereotyped and almost neo-colonialist kind of historical discourse. But for that to happen, history has to be valued not only in North American Adventism and Australian Adventism, it needs to be widely valued in other parts of Adventism as well, because then the work is more likely to be done.
It does seem to me that part of what I'm getting out of our conference is a much broader picture of what Adventist history and historians can be involved in, both for the church to educate all of our people, and for the broader community of the world, because I think we do have something to say to them as well.
Just quickly, and out of context, but to keep a promise I made to our academic dean. One of the questions he asked me, does ASDA keep a record, a database of who is doing graduate study, so that as positions come open, we know who's in graduate school and what areas they're studying? A suggestion that we're out of time, but I have now kept my promise.
Thank you. And with our new website, we're working on trying to move that direction. So thank you for the reminder, and those of you who would like to list yourselves or other people you know as individuals in historical study looking towards employment, and we would be glad to hear from you and work on that aspect of the website.
And people that know that might not be here, we ought to report it.
True. Thank you. Thank you, panelists. Let's give them a hand.
I have some closing thoughts. I don't know whether they're good or not. We'll find out. So. First, I just want to thank all of you who came, and also those of you who stayed. We're about 50% of where we were this morning, but Adventists know all about the falling away and the faithful and the remnant. And backsliders. Thank you, Alfredo. Precisely so. We know who the backsliders are, and those who are weak. I had hoped to have a final sort of discussion period, just going over what are any common themes we could pick out from today. We're running already over 10 minutes late, and I sense perhaps that there is some weariness. It's been a very full day. So what I'm going to do is actually to propose literally just some final thoughts, and suggest that we all think about them. And if you feel that I'm incorrect in any area, or there's an important area not touched on, that you email me. But before I do that, I do just want to first say what is going to happen with the papers that we have heard. I would like each person who gave a paper, please, to email it to me. With your permission, we will post it online on the AdventistArchives.org website. Our plan is to publish a selection of papers. As you're aware, they're somewhat diverse, and it wouldn't make a good single collection, but we will publish a selection of papers. Posting the papers online shouldn't hurt or harm that, really, because we anticipate that people will want to develop the text of their paper for publication in any case. But so it would be good. We've already received email requests from people who couldn't be here for the text of papers. So if I can ask each of you who gave a paper, please email me a copy, and we will post them online on the archives website. But the plan is to move forward with publishing a selection either as a special issue of a journal or possibly as a separate stand-alone volume. So we will update you as that happens. Just to let you know, this is perhaps not widely known, but when the position of GC Archivist was created, one of the purposes or functions he was given was this: that he develop cooperative working relationships with existing denominational archives and assist in the development of other research and archive centers that may be approved. In this role, he would give attention to coordinating the resources for denominational research throughout the World Church so as to bring about the most serviceable utilization of existing denominational source materials. So my job actually, as well as the institutional repository of the General Conference, does give me a kind of roving commission, as it were, to promote Adventist history and to promote the conservation and utilization of historical materials relating to Adventism. And I just say that so that as I offer these few thoughts, you're aware that it's part of my job to offer them to you. I've been thinking about what has emerged from today. What are significant issues for Adventist historiography, and what is it we need? What is it we need to do more of or to do better? And here are some suggestions, and as I say, please email me your suggestions for anything I've got wrong, anything that I've left out. Here are what I see as some significant issues. First, how many historians of Adventism think of themselves as researchers as opposed to teachers. This was something that Dan Renault's paper brought out, and I think was overlooked probably. He made the point, I think, if I'm paraphrasing you, that Gary Land was perhaps the first Adventist historian who thought of himself as a researcher. That isn't to say that it has to be one doesn't have to choose, except in the United Kingdom, between being a researcher and a teacher. But I do think an awful lot of Adventist historians would think of themselves as primarily a teacher, or really solely a teacher, and certainly that their job description and the way that they are employed and their working conditions makes them only a teacher. And it seems to me that is a significant issue, that if more and better Adventist history is to be written, there need to be more people working on it. Another issue, it seems to me, is how many Adventist historians are given any kind of institutional support for research. And I know at least one person who's spoken here today, when he received a sabbatical, it meant he taught 3 classes instead of 4. That was the generous benefaction of his institution. And other places, but of course, wouldn't even get a sabbatical at all. I think there is a need. I think there is a need to communicate more to academic leadership of the importance of Adventist history and its role in the wider church, and that there's actually huge amounts of Adventist history that have never been researched or written, and therefore there's a need to give some kind of support for research. How significant is it, another issue, how significant is it that many historians of Adventism are not professionally trained historians? This is perhaps a sensitive issue. And I don't mean, let me be clear, to say that if you're not trained as a professional historian, you don't do good history. And I think actually of a debate that took place in Reformation history circles about 10 years ago, when somebody pointed out that 2 very well-known historians were very religiously engaged. And there was quite a debate, and the point made was in fact that almost all the historians of the English Reformation are themselves confessionally engaged. It's quite interesting that it's still the case. The point wasn't to say Eamon Duffy is a Catholic and Patrick Collinson is a Baptist, which is the case. Those names will mean something to some of you. The point is, what work did they do? What evidence did they find, and how did they analyze it? And I think that's the same. The point isn't to say whether someone did a PhD in theology or historical theology or economic history. The point is to say what kind of research do they do, and what kind of analysis do they make of their sources. And we could add, I saw Beverly looking at one of her students, and I look at Karl. We have 2 people here who are English professors. Though if you deal with the Renaissance and the Middle Ages, I think you're really almost historians. So, but the point I do think is significant is that people trained in historical theology don't ask the same sort of questions as someone who's a professionally trained historian asks. It isn't that they do bad work, but they just don't ask the same sort of questions. So when I say this is an issue, I don't mean it's a disastrous flaw, but I do think it is. How significant is it that many historians of Adventism are not trained as professional historians, but very often in religious studies and theology? Thinking about what is needed, I have a list, and this is certainly not complete. It seems to me if we think about thematically what areas we need more social history, and that's why I appreciated Karl's paper. We need more efforts to identify ordinary Adventists, as Michael is doing using the testimonies by a very close reading of them, but then to explore what was it like. The social history, of course, of not only religion but of medicine. Social history has become a dominant discourse in a number of historical sub-disciplines, but not in Adventist history. And I think it's a weakness. I think it is. There may be some areas that we think, well, we don't have much of that, but who cares? It seems to me that lack of knowing what did it mean to be an ordinary Adventist keeping the Sabbath in the 1880s, as opposed to the people who were arrested and imprisoned, as Antonia told us about. But what did it mean to keep the Sabbath? What did it mean to believe in health reform? What I think social history is really needed. I think we need critical history of mission, and this is a particular area I feel drawn to, and in my work here have contributed to. But mission is something that is almost entirely studied from a contemporary perspective. There's almost no historical missiology in Adventism. Missiologists don't study it historically. And it seems to me we don't want to fall into a simple triumphalist narrative. We need critical history, but we do need historical studies of mission and what did it mean to be an Adventist missionary? Are there differences between being an Adventist missionary and between being a Presbyterian, Methodist, Anglican, Baptist, and so on missionary? I do think we need more, again, this is a huge area in contemporary historiography, gender studies. I think some would disagree with me, I suspect, but it does seem to me that almost all the consideration of gender is linked to Ellen White and or to ordination. And gender is obviously a much bigger subject area and has been very fruitfully theorized and engaged with by critical historians in a way that Adventist history has started to but has not yet achieved. I think economic and financial history is one of the biggest areas of weakness. Ron Graybill wrote an article, and a short article, on the prosperity of early Adventists, and that's about the only work on economic history that I'm aware of, literally one article. And you may be able to add a couple of others, but this is not something people have worked on much. How is it that such a small church is able to create and then maintain such an impressive foreign mission program? Is it possible that Adventists were actually more wealthy than we give them credit for? We all know the stories of Ellen and James White crossing the Mississippi and in the ice and starving. There's no doubt that our pioneer leaders were poor, but were all Adventist pioneers poor? Were we richer than we have given credit for? These things that it's maybe difficult to find sources for, but there are sources available, especially now, as Garry alluded to, with the various kinds of websites that are available. It's possible to find out all kinds of information about ordinary people, their tax status, all sorts of things. So I think that area of history is opening up to research in a way that wasn't true even, say, 10 years ago. If we think about, I would also add, I think we need to engage with the idea of empire and imperialism. Who of you here knows the story of how Seleucia came into being? I think probably a fair number of you. Well, if not, it's an exciting story. But what it comes down to is that Adventists were given a huge grant of land conquered from the Matabele by Cecil Rhodes. When I read the story as a boy, my heart thrilled to the faith of the people who said to Cecil Rhodes, please give us lots of land. And he more or less said, well, name your figure. And he gave them, I don't know, huge, vast acreages of land. And then I came to be older, and it's sort of like, I'm not sure I'm so proud of that. Now, of course, I would think that Adventists at Seleucia did rather better by the local people than most British colonialists of that period, but still, that would be just a quick example of an area where we haven't really perhaps thought through some of the relationships that we have been involved with in the church. Now, I do think there will be some positives there as well, because we know from history of Anglican missions that it was Anglican and congregational missionaries who actually protected what it was then Bechuana land, it is now Botswana, and stopped Cecil Rhodes annexing it. And I think we would find admirable and noble things if we started to engage with imperialism and colonialism in our historiography. So it's not just a matter of looking for negatives, but it's an area we just sort of haven't, I think, even explored. Chronologically, I would emphasize again, I think we have really wonderful work now on the first 40 or 50 years of Adventism, and on the period of the interwar years and the immediate aftermath of World War II, the World War II period, there's very, very little. And then it heats up because people have worked on the Questions of Doctrine episode. But from the 1919 Bible Conference up to the 1952 Bible Conference, in which Michael has written, it seems to me there's not an awful lot, and yet this is when our church actually becomes truly a worldwide church. So chronologically, that seems to me to be an issue. And finally, I would say, I think we need, and this is comes close to my home, we need better preserved, better catalogued, more accessible archival sources. This was something Dr. Phillips spoke about, and I completely concur. He mentioned there are no institutional policies. There actually are institutional policies for preserving the records of conferences, unions, and institutions, but those policies are honoured more often in the breach than the observance. So I think there is the need again for Adventist historians and archivists to communicate with church leaders and again say this is why this is important. I don't think we can promise to create a triumphalist narrative, because I think most of us here wouldn't really believe in that. But I do believe, I quote it because I do believe it, that we have nothing to fear for the future except as we shall forget. Because I think seeing the way the Lord has led, seeing the way that we as Adventists have made some terrible mistakes and blunders in not responding to the Lord's prompting, seeing the way He has taught us, both, as it were, explicitly and implicitly, I think we have a huge amount to take forward and go confidently into the future with. So I think there is much we can offer. I do think we need to get away from the idea that we can, and this isn't true by any means of anyone, probably anyone here, but I think one can see it over recent years, a kind of feeling that you have to prove your bona fides as an historian by attacking the church if you want to be taken seriously by scholars outside Adventism. I don't think that's true if you look at the success of historians like Marsden and Knoll, who are faithful to their own tradition but also excellent critical historians. So I think, I don't quite know how to tread that fine line between seeking and telling the truth and yet ultimately being affirming of what I certainly believe is God's remnant church called for a certain purpose. I don't think it will ever be easy, but I do think there's a vital role for Adventist historians to play there, not only in the wider journey that as an historian I feel an obligation to historical truth. It's terribly old-fashioned and 19th century of me, but there it is. But I also feel that sort of obligation to the church. I think if we can communicate that to church leaders, communicate that we have something to offer, then I think there is more likely to be better preservation of church archives, perhaps greater sympathy for the needs to support research by academic scholars, and also getting away from it was striking, in some papers reminded us that at certain times in our history, being an Adventist historian was a somewhat dangerous profession to be in. And hopefully those days are now behind us as well. But so those are some of the things that I feel as areas that are of significance or areas that we need more or we need to do better. As I say, I'm sure I've missed some things and I would welcome your emails. But at this point, it being 6:30, I'll say again, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Edward, for your support and that of ASDAH. ASDAH does a wonderful job, and I hope we can see the current development with the Constitution and so forth, see it really flourish over the next few years. And I thank you all for contributing, because I do think we have, as I say, we do have an important and special role within our own faith community as well as academics and scholars.
Thanks to you.
Yeah.
At this point, I'll ask Sarah to dismiss us with a benediction, please. You can, whichever you prefer.
Let's bow our heads. Oh God, it's such a privilege to be here and to meet together and to share stories. And after all, that is a great part of your ministry, was sharing stories and helping people to relate to things in their lives. And God, I ask that you'd help us to use these stories for your glory, that we would be able to share them with those around us, and help people to understand that the challenges that they're facing now, whatever they may be, are not new. They're challenges that we faced before, and we can make it through. And God, I ask that you be with us, be with our church. We're longing for you to come back, Father. Give us the patience and the endurance. Give us the excitement for your soon coming. May we speed up your return by sharing the gospel with everyone that we meet. In your name I pray. Amen.
Amen.